Well, good afternoon. It's my pleasure to have the opportunity to interact with the Speaker of the House of Representatives in Washington, joining us online. I think we've reached a point where we're fronted with the reality that modern elites do not demand so much toleration as capitulation and celebration, and often it becomes extremely hard to engage in a meaningful way to, as you might put it, demonstrate respectful disagreement and find consensus. Can I welcome you to ARC in London, to our guest all the way from Washington. Thank you, Speaker Johnson.
What a great opportunity, and I apologize to my friends for not being there in person. Congress is in the midst of an earnest session right now, as this tends to happen during ARC dialogue, so at least I can attend by Zoom. I'm there in spirit.
Well, thank you very much for your time. Now, your country is about to mark its 250th anniversary since the signing of the Declaration of Independence. This happens at a time of deep political division and seriously declining trust right across the West. What do you think's been lost in terms of the way that we now talk to one another about politics? What would it take to recover a shared sense of purpose without demanding agreement, capitulation, celebration of ideas that we can't personally accept?
Well, thank you. It's a very important question, one that we wrestle with here in the United States Congress every day and across our country. We are celebrating this incredible anniversary, the 250th year of our independence and celebration of freedom and all that goes with that. It is arguably, in my view, never been more important for us to have open dialogue and discussion and understanding so that we can preserve this grand experiment in self-governance. So the question is, how do you do that? I think there's some guiding ideas and principles that all of us share. I mean, first of all, we've got to make sure that we understand that the antidote to hatred and vitriol is more speech. There has been an inclination in recent years, as there always is, to censor and silence speech, and no matter how well intended that is, we believe that you have to have a discourse. So how do you foster it? I think we look at the root problems of this. One of the causes is, of course, the deterioration of our mediating institutions, things that we all cherish, believe in, and fight for, the family, the church, our community groups, because that's where we learn to see one another as fellow human beings and value this idea of shared liberty and freedom and community. And so I think it's always an important priority of ours, must be, to restore and rebuild, to strengthen those institutions and not let them continue to deteriorate as they do. I had the great honor and privilege of speaking to the British Parliament back in January there in London, and when I spoke there, I talked about the very honest challenge we have in America, and that is to pass along this idea to the next generation who are increasingly hostile to these ideas. They're hostile to discourse and even to the founding principles of our country. And I know many of us share that challenge in common. And so I think for us on this anniversary year, it's a teachable moment to remind the people come behind us how important these principles are, and to dig in deeper than we ever have before. We had a wake-up call here just last night in New York City. We had some primary elections for the Democratic seats in Congress, and the socialists, the Marxists, prevailed pretty decisively there. We've got to recognize this is a battle of philosophies and ideas, and we have to engage it directly. But respectfully, I think we can win those arguments on the merits.
Well, Mike, a quarter of the delegates here are young people. They have grown up in an environment where the incentives in the modern public space and politics often seem to reward outrage, certainty, black and white certainty, conflict, rather than listening and, as you said, talking, communicating, establishing a common humanity and the art of persuasion. In one of the most contested political environments in the world, how do you personally try to engage with people who profoundly disagree with you and all that you stand for? And what have you learnt about meaningful dialogue with people of a different persuasion?
You know, I think that all of us in this modern era are facing challenges to this that have not been faced by previous generations. And I reference specifically, social media, for example. It is a great toxin to politics and public discourse. It tends to have people increasingly fenced off. The algorithms drive people more deeper into their peccadillos and persuasions and prejudices, frankly. There's still a lot of camaraderie here in the United States Congress, but it gets overshadowed by this perverse incentive there is on social media for even members of Congress to go on and say very divisive and unproductive things. I had a recent example with a colleague over on the Senate side. I run the House. But there's a senator from Georgia, Raphael Warnock, who's a good man. But I had heard someone had sent to me a clip of something he said about me on a podcast interview where he questioned my faith because of the difference we had on a big piece of legislation. So rather than me going on social media and criticizing him and escalating this, I just called him, as we should, as an elected official, colleague to one another. Invited him over to my office. I was delighted that he accepted the invitation and came over within 15 minutes or so. He and I sat down together and had a very productive dialogue about differences. We both identify as Christians. We see the commands of the New Testament a little differently with regard to whether the commands are given to individuals or to the civil authorities, the government, how we handle wealth in society, etc. But, I just thought that was very important. We both enjoyed the dialogue. We agreed that we should do more of that. And we should do it face-to-face instead of using, the internet to air our grievances. I think that's really important. Obviously, we have the same challenges. And I always tell my colleagues, I will never ask them to compromise a core principle. But when you're part of a deliberative legislative body, you must compromise your preferences. None of us will ever get 100% of what we want. And I think that's a really, really important deal. We live in probably the most polarized and divided political environment that we have had in our country since the Civil War 160 years ago. And we're trying to navigate through that every day. I just think that when we treat one another with dignity and respect, I think the key to all this, the root of all of it, is that we have to see one another as our Creator does. And I'm delighted to say that in the birth certificate of America, the Declaration of Independence, which we celebrate 250th signing up on July 4th, it says right there boldly in the second paragraph, G.K. Chesterton, the great British statesman and philosopher, said one time, America is the only nation in the world that's founded upon a creed. It's listed with almost theological lucidity in the Declaration. And it's that famous statement, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And we're endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, among those rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. I'll just conclude with this, John, by saying the implication behind that is so important, because the founders who wrote that language also understood, they were students of Scripture, they understood that we were made in the image of God. And if that is true, and it is, it means that every single person has an inestimable dignity and value, and our value is not related in any way to the color of our skin or what neighborhood we grew up in or what our talents are. Our value is inherent, it is given to us by God. And if we remember that about every single person, it allows us to get beyond the arguments of the day and get to the root of the issue, and that's the value of every human being.
I think it would be fair to say that the death of Charlie Kirk sent shockwaves around the world, because suddenly it seems that there are a lot of people in our community who see political opponents as not simply wrong, but as threats, who somehow should be removed, in inverted commas. How do we rebuild trust and a common purpose and a respect sufficiently strong enough for one another to recognise the humanity in a person we disagree with, when this mindset seems to have taken quite deep hold? I'm aware of a young person in Australia who went to work very happy indeed, apparently, and a friend of mine said, "Why are you so happy this morning?" She said, "Charlie Kirk's been shot." She was celebrating it. How do we overcome that break in our capacity to recognise the humanity in a person that we disagree with?
Well, Charlie Kirk was a dear friend of mine, and his loss has been so profound. It was another wake-up call for American society, and I think to many people around the world, he was an important voice, a singular voice in our culture and in our generation. We miss him. Interestingly, Charlie spoke prophetically so often, and he said famously before his tragic loss that when people stop talking, that's when you get violence. See, Charlie understood, and he was a great advocate and an example of the idea that you engage in more dialogue. It's so important that you have to draw people out, you have to listen to them, understand where they're coming from, get to really the root of the disagreement, and then address it with clarity and conviction and consistency with truth. And you speak the truth in love. Charlie did that. He never had animosity or hatred for the person on the other side of the dialogue or the other side of the table. He loved that person. He was motivated by love. He spoke of it very eloquently because he was trying to reach them with the truth. Again, not just about the policy of the day, but with the underlying truth that everybody desperately needs and yearns for, whether they recognize it or not. When the conversation stops, that's when political violence foments, because then people sort of isolate themselves from society and they dig in deeper into these dark and dangerous ideas, and it leads to violence. Last September, I attended the G7 speakers meeting, and the leaders of the other parliaments, some of my counterparts, we talked about how this idea is common. The rise of political violence is frightening, and it's more common around the world, not just isolated to one party or one nation. It's something that all of us have to do together. And I think Charlie's a great model. He died as a martyr for the truth, and he did it fearlessly, and he did it out of love. He was trying to win more than an argument. I would say it as he said. He was trying to win people over to the truth and win souls at the end of the day. That's how he saw it. That's how I see it.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's all too brief, but I think all of us here would like to, including your fellow countrymen in London. By the way, a bit of American air conditioning technology, or perhaps we could help out from Australia. It's very warm here. But we would like to wish you, I think, collectively, a happy birthday, and to say this, that perhaps the best present America could give itself would be to regather the inspiring story of how people, many of them with very different perspectives, hammered out a remarkable constitution for a free nation. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.